Welcome to episode 23 of the Active Bariatric Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Terapelli, bariatric sports dietitian. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to have on Dr. Darren Candow. Dr. Candow is a professor and director of the Aging, Muscle, and Bone Health Laboratory in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the University of Regina, Canada. The overall objectives of Dr. Candow's internationally renowned research program are to develop effective lifestyle interventions involving nutrition, primarily creatine monohydrate, and physical activity resistance training, which have practical and clinical relevance for improving musculoskeletal aging and reducing the risk of falls and fractures. Dr. Candow has published over 100 peer-refereed journal manuscripts, supervised over 20 master's and PhD students, and received research funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, and the Nutricia Research Foundation. In addition, Dr. Candow serves on the editorial review boards for the Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition, Nutrients, and Frontiers. Thank you so much for being on today. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me. That intro made me sound smart, so I better try to live up to the hype here, I guess. Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh. Well, I appreciate it because, of course, I've followed you for a long time, but also with creatine just really gaining so much momentum. And I know it's been around for so much time, but I just really wanted to pick your brain today because I have a lot of bariatric athletes who, through obviously going through bariatric surgery, having a lot of significant weight loss, sometimes that incorporating muscle loss as well, looking at creatine to see if it's something that they can utilize after the surgery to change body composition. So I just wanted to pick your brain today.
Absolutely. I can't wait. Yep.
Cool. Okay. Well, tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in creatine research.
Yeah, it was, I always say my career has been by accident almost. I did my graduate degree at the University of Saskatchewan, which is 2 hours north of my institution now, with Dr. Phil Chillibeck, who I consider one of the best clinical researchers, not only in Canada, but in the world. So I really lucked out to have such an outstanding mentor. And then I also started to work with Dr. Darren, who was sort of a pioneer when it came to doing ergogenic aids, and we looked at a number of supplements. And at the time, my master's thesis was on a single amino acid called glutamine, and we combined that with weight training and did not find any effect. And I think a lot of people know glutamine by itself is pretty much, useless, I guess, if I could say that, unless you have an inflammatory condition. But right at the time, creatine monohydrate supplementation was about 10 years into its explosion of interest. And it became so popular, we sort of switched gears from just single amino acids or even proteins and started to focus on creatine monohydrate. I think at the time, because it was so popular, again, it got really a lot of momentum in 1992 and 1996. It was discovered in 1832 by French chemists, but it sort of went away for over almost a century. So it's had a unique history, but ever since about 1992, when one of the first studies came out really touting the benefits of creatine getting into the blood and then potentially into the muscle, it's sort of taken off. And our last count was there's well over 1,000 peer-refereed publications on creatine monohydrate in a variety of populations, not just athletes. So I think I lucked out. It was by accident how and I've been doing creatine research ever since 2001, basically. So yeah, last a couple of years ago.
I love that. Wow. Well, you gave us a little bit about when it was kind of discovered, but can you tell, for those that don't know or know much about creatine, how does it, function? Why should we be interested in it? How does it function in our body?
Yeah. So, firstly, it's naturally synthesized primarily in two areas of our body. The first process, it starts in the kidneys and then it ends up finally in the liver. And that's the one we're most familiar with. And simply, creatine is just 3 amino acids that we naturally have in the body or eat when we consume food products: arginine, glycine, and methionine. So to the average person, those 3 amino acids are meaningless, and we just typically consume those through food products such as red meat or seafood primarily. And you can get some of those amino acids in plant-based products as well. But our body takes those and packages those in. I will say the brain actually can synthesize its own creatine as well, but to a much smaller extent. So I think most people think of creatine being naturally in the body, or what's more popular now, of course, is supplementation. You can get creatine in red meat and seafood at a concentration or an amount we think can be beneficial. But financially, with the cost of food nowadays, red meat and seafood is super expensive. If you have allergies, or your individual belief about ethical treatment of animals, whichever it is, a lot of
Sure.
people will just switch to creatine supplementation, which to my knowledge, they're all plant-based. And if they're third-party tested and safe, there should be no issues. I know the cost of creatine supplements have gone up ever since COVID-19,
Right.
but relatively compared to food, they're still very inexpensive. And I will say 99, if not all the studies, I know there's only one out there that have looked at creatine in food, but every study you come across is the supplementation. So when we refer to creatine supplementation, it's the powder or gel form, whichever you're preferring. They're not referring to what's in the diet, except for Roger Harris, who was probably one of the most elite creatine researchers ever. He's pioneered our champion cause. They did a study with meat extract and just looking at different dosages. So, to my knowledge, there's one, maybe a few others that have looked at the creatine content in food. But for your
Sure.
viewers, when we talk about creatine, we're really referring to the supplementation.
Right. Right. And we'll talk a little bit about the different forms that are out there and
Right.
how you can get it. But so tell us, how does if for someone that's going to be active or they're going to start lifting, how is creatine an energy source, as utilized by our muscles, for example, if we're going to be lifting weights, for example?
Yeah. So creatine is always sacrificed whenever we engage in any activities of daily living, and more sacrificed when we engage in high intensity activities such as intense cardiovascular exercise or weightlifting or sports.
Mhm.
So to maintain our energy currency of the cell called adenosine triphosphate, or most people know this as ATP, we can break down carbohydrates, fat, and protein to satisfy those requirements. But the most rapid way to maintain those during intense exercise, such as a 100-meter sprint or during multiple repetitions of a leg press, is phosphocreatine. And that's simply creatine being phosphorylated with another bond called a phosphate group. And once it's phosphorylated, it's trapped inside our muscle, and it simply maintains our ATP stores to allow us to exercise at a higher intensity and for a longer period of time. So that was really where the basis of creatine came from. People who consume creatine supplementation and or increase it through the diet, you would often hear them say they can do more repetitions, they could exercise at a higher capacity or training intensity. They didn't feel as sore or had as much inflammation after exercise, and that allowed them to get into the gym or practice, whichever, more frequently. And lo and behold, at the end of the day, a lot of people said they felt bigger, stronger, faster. So for most athletes, that was very advantageous.
Sure.
And it's sort of blossomed from an athlete population to now it's getting into phenomenal benefits for a lot of special populations, anything from the elderly to females who are pregnant, to children having a lot of benefits. So I say there's not a person on the planet that can't benefit some way from creatine. And I'd be hard pressed to find someone who would suffer any detrimental effects. We've looked at side effects, and we can talk about that later, for up
Yeah.
to 2 years, and we don't see any effect at recommended dosages. So again, I think a lot of people think this is too good to be true. It's something that seems to be very beneficial. No adverse effects, or the safety profile is excellent. So I
Hmm.
think there's always some people trying to look at the non-evidence based research to come up with something against it. And just like everything, it's a sprinkle on the cake.
Right.
99% of the time, you need to exercise. Creatine may just give you a little bit more flavorful exercise, if you will, but
Sure.
they're now having some more clinical benefits, and we can talk about the neck up being a really popular area. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to go back real quick because you were talking about creatine in the diet, and I just wanted to emphasize for folks that, especially with the population that I
Yes.
work with, because our intake is reduced.
Mhm.
So some folks have asked me, well, can I just, because you said that it's found in meat and seafood, can I just eat enough in my diet? And
Mhm.
especially with bariatric clients, I usually counter back with, we're just getting the bare needs met as someone that's
Yes.
especially initially after surgery and moving out, but overall for life, their intake is reduced compared to someone who hasn't had bariatric surgery.
Right.
And so I just wanted to hear you, if you don't mind sharing how it typically it's easier to get that creatine in through a supplementation of it versus the diet because you'd have to eat so much more. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the average person will produce in our kidneys and liver about anywhere between 1 to 3 grams a day, and we typically excrete a byproduct of creatine called creatinine. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of viewers say, "Oh, when I went to my doctor and they did blood work, they measured my creatinine," and I say, "Well, just make sure you tell them you're on creatine because your creatinine is going to be elevated acutely, but your
Hmm.
kidneys filter that no problem." So we excrete about an equal amount. So if you ask someone, do I need to take creatine supplementation to have healthy muscles? Absolutely not. There's a lot of individuals such as vegans who are very healthy and get great gains and have a lot of health benefits. But the research suggests if you can sort of increase the amount in the body, you get even greater benefits. It's kind of like thinking of when you started coffee drinking and you started with a very small amount and you titrate that up to a larger amount, you may get more greater stimulating effects. Right. So that's something to be careful of, that you don't need supplementation. Now, if you want to get it through the diet, unfortunately, to get the extra few grams, which seems to be the minimal amount to be effective from a muscle perspective, you would have to eat at least additional 1 to 2 servings of red meat or seafood a day. So the next time you go to Costco or whatever, when you look at the price of meat, it's going to be just way too expensive. Right. So supplementation is very viable. I think 2 to 3 grams of creatine extra is only half a teaspoon of powder. So I think that's why a lot of people go that way, if you're just looking at it from the lowest, most effective dose. Right. So I think the more viable option is to consider supplementation. You can choose red meat or seafood. There's only trace amounts, unfortunately, in poultry or dairy. So those are the two main food sources that seem to have the higher concentration. But again, the cost, the ethical use of animals, whatever your own preference is, it can influence that. But the lowest dose shown to be effective is about 3 grams in a healthy population. There's been one study that looked at a clinical population with a little bit lower dosage, but that was over a year long, where they had issues in the eye. They were looking at eye atrophy. But for a healthy individual, 3 grams seems to be the lowest dose shown to have some beneficial effects. But when you excrete about 1 to 3 grams a day and you add in that little amount, that's where the 5 grams recommended dosage seems to be popular. Right. And one of the first studies in 1992 to show this is that a 5-gram intake will really elevate the creatine in your blood, and that'll subsequently get into your muscles. So that's why 3 to 5 grams is very viable, effective, and totally safe dosage that children, adults, and older adults can take from a muscle perspective. That may not be the case for bone or brain, and we can talk about that later.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into the dosing real quick. So the 3 to 5 gram per day is the kind of a standard dose that you can take daily. And we'll talk about duration and things like that. But what are the other dosing protocols, like a loading dose versus a relative dose? Can you kind of talk about those?
Yeah, so the loading dose was originally designed for athletes who need a really quick fix. So our muscles have a maximal storing capacity for creatine, and a loading dose refers to 20 grams a day for about 5 to 7 days. And the reason this became so popular, in that study in 1992 by Roger Harris, they actually did the loading phase, and they clearly showed that multiple 5-gram dosages up to about 20 or 30 grams a day maximize the amount of creatine that are not only in the blood, but getting into the muscle. So if you say, hey, I want to take this, I really want to get the most positive reinforcement as fast as possible, creatine loading is by far the most effective way to do that. The only downfall we see with creatine loading is where creatine is an osmotic compound. It likes to take water from your plasma into your cells. A lot of people say, hey, I gained weight. And that's a typical response to creatine loading, where some people might think, hey, I put on 3 or 4 pounds, I feel a bit more bloated. So that's all that's happening, and your body does adjust to that. There's an alternative, 2 other strategies that seem to be very popular. If you don't want to do the loading phase, which is totally fine, you can take a low daily dose. It'll just take a little bit longer to accumulate. So for example, 3 grams a day without a loading phase will saturate your muscles in about 30 days. The same amount of saturation as you got from 20 grams a day for 5 to 7 days. So you now have 2 options. I can do the loading phase, and I should point out, after the loading phase, you can reduce that to about 3 to 5 grams a day, and that will maintain your normal stores. Or you say, you know what, I'm not an athlete going to the Olympic Games next week or whatever it is. I have a big championship coming up. I'm going to take this for lifelong health. Let's just do a low dose. It's going to cost me less money. It's easier to remember to take it. So 3 to 5 grams, you can take it in solution, put it in your yogurt, whatever it is. Once a day, it's very easy to do. There's no taste to it. The one we like to do is a relative dose. So this keeps sex equated. So when we do lab studies, males and females have the same relative dose. And we do 0.1 gram of creatine per kilogram. So if you're 70 kilograms, you get 7 grams a day. If you're 100 kilograms, you get 10 grams a day. The theory here is that the larger you are, you have more of these things called creatine transporters or doorways that allow creatine into the cell. So the theory is the larger you are, we can give you a higher dose because that'll have a relative amount getting into the muscle.
Right.
We've probably published 40 studies now using that dosage. It's been very effective with no side effects.
Excellent.
So now those are sort of the 3 options. You have the loading phase followed by really low dose maintenance, or you say, you know what, I'm just going to take the small 3 to 5 grams a day. You can take that for years and years on end, and it's super easy to remember. Or if you want to get a little bit more fancy, if you will, the relative dose that we like to do, 0.1 gram per kilogram. The one caveat I will say is if you're an adult 50 years and above, we do see some evidence that the loading phase is important for increasing strength. And one of the reasons is we think as we get older, we have a little bit of an impairment in creatine kinetics, or we don't eat as much red meat in our diet as we used to. So we've done a recent meta-analysis and showed that a loading phase is important to do for adults 50 and above, again, followed by that really low dosage if you're looking to improve muscle strength.
Yeah. And I've heard you on other podcasts say, because some folks will voice that concern of, oh, I saw the, weight go up on the scale.
Yes.
I'm, oh gosh. And especially with my clientele who is, they've had bariatric surgery. And I know you've said before, that's a great sign. That means that you're, you're responding well. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's important to point out.
Yeah, there's something called a responder and a non-responder. And very rare will you say, God, I've tried creatine. I didn't notice anything. Right. And then if they're a younger individual, we don't really need to worry about the age-related biological process of muscle like sarcopenia, which could be interfering. But when I ask the individual, can you tell me about your diet? And it doesn't matter where they are, they'll say, well, I typically eat, a steak or so a day. I eat a lot of chicken. I have a serving of seafood. When you look at their habitual diet, it looks like they're already getting a lot of creatine already. But when flip that, when you talk to a vegan, vegetarian, or someone on a plant-based diet, and they take creatine, they seem to respond really well. And so the main dictating factor to this responder, non-responder is your initial creatine stores. If you have a low amount in your muscles, such as a vegan, you will respond, no doubt, to creatine supplementation. If you're on a carnivore diet or a high omnivore diet in red meat and seafood, you may not respond hardly at all from a muscle perspective. Sure. That's always responder or non-responder is from a muscle perspective. With the new emerging research on brain health, I think even someone on a carnivore diet, if they suffered a concussion, they may still have some beneficial effects from supplementation. Sure. So that's typically what dictates if you're a responder. Now, one other cool way to know that is if you do take creatine, you notice you're improving exercise capacity. You have less soreness the next day. You may have put on 1 or 2 pounds the first week. You feel stronger. That's an indication that you probably are going to have a great response to creatine supplementation.
Oh, good. I thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, because I know we get that concern, and I think that that's sometimes, and back at some other myths, in the old days was, it causes muscle cramping, and and then I know you'll talk about the baldness and those types of myths that are out there, but really
we did a big paper on that. The cramping was very unique because there's some anecdotal reports in the United States where wrestlers will wear a rubber suit, go in a sauna, and they were on a really toxic level of a supplement. And of course, everything is attributed to the supplement, but actually creatine is hyper hydrating. So if anything, it'll actually decrease the amount of cramping because it's putting more water into the muscle. So exercising in hotter environments, creatine will cause more water to be trapped into the muscle, which will decrease dehydration. So these are things that always, I guess for viewers, always focus on the evidence-based researchers and hopefully the influencers who get so much press on social media and all that they're giving out correct advice. Every day I see incorrect information and I look at the comments and it could be thousands of people following what this individual is stating. The latest was how creatine monohydrate degrades to creatinine if it's not used immediately. And there's excellent studies showing years and years stored in your garage. If it's dry, cool, it does not degrade. So people probably went and bought a new form that costs double the amount of money. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there, just like everything. And I think in this case, you want to trust the peer-reviewed publications and the scientists who actually do the data collection. not just the people who steal the data collection and throw it out there. You don't know if it's true or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. And talk to us a little bit about timing of creatine. And I
Mm.
know that, in terms of, is there a beneficial time to take it? I've heard that there really isn't, as long as you're being
Yeah.
consistent with it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've done a few studies on this now. My PhD student is finally going to answer the question to the full degree here when he does his dissertation studies. But at the end of the day, it does not matter when you take creatine supplementation. You can take it in the morning before you work out. You can actually mix it in your water bottle and drink it during your workout. You can have it after, before going to bed. So unlike caffeine, there's actually been shown now, and there's several studies almost approaching double digits that have clearly showed that the timing of creatine ingestion does not matter compared to another time of creatine. So this is important. If you're comparing creatine to placebo, it doesn't matter when you take it. There's a good chance that you're going to get a greater response. But if you say, can I take creatine before or should I take it after? I'll say you have two options. You can take it both, or you can take it one at a time. So the timing is irrelevant, probably because it needs to accumulate in your muscle cells, bone cells, as well as the brain. Whereas caffeine, 60 minutes before, it peaks in your blood and then starts to come down. So the timing is kind of irrelevant. There's a bit of good logic to suggesting close proximity to exercise. Increased blood flow, your cells have worked, they're starving for this energy currency. So I always have a teaspoon of creatine in my breakfast in the morning. I typically have Greek yogurt and berries, and I usually put some whey protein in there as well. So I'll put 5 grams of creatine in there. And I actually prefer to drink another 5 grams during my Peloton or weight training session. Okay. So I take at least 10 grams a day from a whole body perspective. But for those just starting out, you could put 2 or 3 grams in Greek yogurt or breakfast, whatever it is. I wouldn't recommend to put it in coffee. We can talk about why that is a little bit later. But I think you can put it in food. Anything that's not highly caffeinated would be okay. And it's easy. It's just whatever's most convenient for you. People say, when is the best time to exercise? Whatever's convenient for you.
Right, absolutely.
Is totally it.
So let's talk about the caffeine, because I wanted to touch on that, because I understand that there might be some interaction that maybe kind of, I don't know, blunts both caffeine and creatine if you take them together. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the original studies that looked at the combination of creatine in hot beverage, tea or coffee, only looked at those experimental studies from an acute session where people came into the lab and they just did a bike test and they went home. But I think most people are saying, hey, I kind of understand the benefits of caffeine. I understand the benefits now potentially of creatine. I work out not just one day a year. I kind of work out on a regular basis. And when you look at the mechanisms of the two, taking it over time, caffeine kind of releases a molecule called calcium, which we're all familiar with. It releases it really quickly from a part of our cell. But at the exact same time, creatine takes it back up. So it's a tug of war. So the theory is if you combine the two, they sort of oppose each other, and some really good cellular data out of Europe have clearly showed this. So I say, since the timing of creatine doesn't matter, why not have your coffee an hour before your workout or tea or whichever, and maybe put your creatine in your post-exercise meal or take it whenever. So that's the logic behind that. And we actually did a study last year, a very small sample size, but when individuals took caffeine powder, combine that with creatine powder, they did not get the same beneficial effect as creatine alone.
Interesting.
So you could argue that the two might have interfered with one another.
Sure.
There needs to be a lot more research on big sample sizes over time, but my recommendation based on the cellular data is to probably separate the two at least by a few hours. Now, people raise their hand and say, what about all these pre-workouts that work? I'm like, I don't know a pre-workout that just has caffeine and creatine in it. They have a whole bunch of other things that could be causing an ergogenic effect. So you can't compare the two.
Yeah. No, but that's good, because that was a question I have, and I've been advising my clients to at least separate it by an hour more, just because of that. I had heard you mention that on another episode. Now, so do we have to cycle on and off creatine? Because I know there's not a ton of, my understanding is there's not a ton of research that has looked at specifically cycling of creatine, and should we do that or not?
I've been planning this study probably for 20 years. It's never been done in the world. This is kind of crazy when you think of it. Next to the baldness question, I probably get, do you need to cycle creatine? The theory here was that there was 2 animal-based studies that showed that when you take exogenous creatine through supplementation, it down-regulated your natural production in the kidney and liver. And then when you stop taking it, it came up, but it's never been looked at in humans. And so the theory here was, should I cycle it to give my body a little bit of a break? To this day, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that you need to cycle creatine. Okay. There's no way to tell, is cycling better than continuous, because the study has never been done. Sure. But I can tell you, we get phenomenal benefits. And in our lab, we've done up to 2 years, over 10 grams a day in large cohort populations, and they still get some benefits. But if you were to ask me, do you need to? The answer is no. But is cycling better than continuous? We don't know. And that still needs to be done.
Gotcha.
So to answer your question, you can take it every day or cycle it. Mm-hmm. And if you do cycle it, this is interesting. It lasts in your muscles for about 30 days. So let's say you take creatine for 4 weeks, and then you say, I'm going on family vacation to Europe, and I don't really want to take my big jug of creatine with me. That's fine. The elevated creatine will last in your muscles for about 30 days. Okay. So if someone is thinking of cycling it, that's how you want to do it. Maybe 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off, and ever. But again, I've taken creatine almost daily for easily a decade, and I don't notice any detrimental effect or things like that.
Yeah. And so that kind of gets into the next question, which is, so I assume, creatine is generally regarded as safe. It's the most researched, supplement out there. But let's talk about specific populations. Let's say someone has a history of renal disease. Would they need to be speaking to their physician first? What do you think about that?
Anybody with any pre-existing abnormalities should always get medical advice and be very clear and let them know that they're taking creatine. Now, if you're taking a supplement that has a lot of other combinational ingredients in there, I recommend to take the supplement to the doctor to make sure, because creatine can be looked at from a nephrology or a kidney and liver area. But if it has about 20 other ingredients, you now may need to look at, will it interfere with statins or beta blockers, things like that. Right, so you always want to get medical screening or advice. In our clinical trials, if anybody has pre-existing kidney or liver abnormalities, we always like to inform the family physician to see if it is safe. So the theory here is, when you take in creatine through supplementation, it will go through the kidney and liver just like everything else a little bit more. But even in individuals with dialysis or some renal impairments, we see that supplementation does not cause any or greater undue stress. There's going to be fluctuations in creatinine and some liver and kidney enzymes as well. But again, if they have pre-existing abnormalities, please make sure you get medical advice and guidance. Again, we go through in labs a lot of ethical principles to make sure the person is considered healthy or under supervision that way. But under recommended dosages, we see that creatine supplementation does not cause any renal or liver abnormalities.
Yeah, good to know. And let's dive then into another population that I get questions about. And I have an adolescent son. Yeah. Children, preteen, teenagers. So I have a 13-year-old son. And I know in knowing that I was interviewing today some of my friends that have sons same age that are starting to lift more. Right. Can you talk a little bit about the utilization of creatine supplementation in that younger population, and is it safe and beneficial?
Right. Yeah. So there's only a few studies that got ethical approval with children or individuals under the age of 18. So there's not a lot of research out there. So when there's not a lot of research, we always recommend caution 100%. Sure. But the argument is, where this molecule is naturally produced in the kidneys and livers of a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 90-year-old, it doesn't matter. Right. It's replicating something very similar into the body. It's like telling a 4-year-old they can't eat chicken or red meat or protein because you're naturally having it. So the good research that has summarized everything, and a couple colleagues in the United States have clearly showed creatine is very beneficial and safe for children. But there's not a lot of biomarkers. We haven't really looked at the kidney and liver enzymes to a great degree. So as it currently stands, creatine is very safe for children at the lower dosages I've already talked about. There's no adverse effects. And it's actually having some huge benefits in the only 2 studies that have looked at concussion in children. It had phenomenal benefits in the children who were concussed. It improved their ability to take care of themselves, speech, emotional control. So it has some benefits there. And now we're actually even seeing benefits to the fetus before development. Like, it's just having an energy currency of the cell. So I know a lot of people say, oh, creatine, isn't that for bodybuilders and athletes? And it is, but it's pretty much for anybody on the planet. Again, I really struggle to find someone that may not have some benefit somewhere in the body. if it's either sleep deprivation or decreasing inflammation, whichever it is.
Right, right. And let's talk about the different forms because, there's so much, there's so much marketing out there that just pushes all these different forms. You have to have this form. It's going to be, absorb better. And I mean, my understanding and from following the research is that creatine monohydrate is the number one best form to supplement with. Is that correct?
Yeah, so creatine monohydrate, of course, is boring, right? We've been doing this forever, and,
Right.
and people that have a lot of really cool business savvy sense of marketing says we got to liven this thing up. We just know it's a white powder, doesn't have any taste, so let's do some other things for it. So you'll start to see a lot of marketing with really bright colors and animals on the bottles, and the one that's getting a lot of press, creatine pyruvate or creatine hydrochloride. So this is an important message for anybody listening. If it's creatine, when it comes into the body, it will mimic exactly what our liver is releasing. So first off, whatever product you're buying, make sure that molecule in there is creatine. It may have some things attached like hydrochloride or pyruvate that can get disassociated, whichever it is, but it still has to have creatine. So creatine monohydrate is identical to the creatine that our liver is producing. Monohydrate means one water molecule attached to it. And when you come into the GI tract or the hydrochloric acid of your stomach, it just disassociates. So monohydrate is identical to what our body's producing. And sometimes other variations can be beneficial as well. To my knowledge, there's never been a single study ever published showing that another form of creatine is superior to monohydrate for having muscle or performance benefits. Creatine, other forms of creatine can get into the bloodstream, and that tells me it is a form of creatine. But I've never come across a study ever that has shown that it's better. So I say, why fix something that isn't broken? Stay with the boring monohydrate. Why? Because it seems to be the best. And the big thing is it has the greatest safety profile. We don't know adding these other chemicals or compounds, can that have any detrimental effects? So I always say, stay with what works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing now more like chews and other products, and I would just based on the dosing, it looks like you do have to take more chews to get the 3 to 5 grams. Whereas for the powdered version, you're just doing the scoop. You can mix that in with fluids or yogurt, things like that. Is there any benefit of powder versus or chew, or is it as long as it's creatine monohydrate, you can take it in either way?
Yeah, the bioavailability of a solid form, excuse me, of a creatine, it's near 100%. So that's why the powder or whatever. But if someone says, I want you to take creatine in solution, be very hesitant and cautious. Creatine in a store-bought solution will degrade to creatinine really quickly. So it's okay for you to mix your creatine in your juice or chocolate milk or water at home and drink it within an hour or so. But if you want to mix it at home and leave it, put it in the fridge, if you cool the temperature, it maintains the stability of creatine. But higher the temperature and or an acidic environment will degrade creatine quicker. So I know there's companies that produce products all the time, and if you come across one that says creatine solution beverage, I would be very cautious until I see empirical data to suggest that it's still creatine when you're drinking it. I'd be very hesitant in speculating that it's not.
Okay. So best would be probably just stick with the powdered form or the gel or the little chews that are coming out now, just making sure that you're taking their proper dosing.
Yeah, so the gels are interesting, or gummies you want to mix for solution. People do this weird thing called dry scooping. And from a creatine perspective, that's nonsensical because you need the water to increase the osmotic potential into it. But people says I dry scoop my creatine. I'm like, okay, fine. But I'm assuming there's some water being consumed after or solution because it goes through the GI tract quicker and it maintains the plasma of the blood. So yeah, I know people that do that for their own preference. You're still going to absorb everything eventually. Yeah. But from a logical perspective, I'm not sure there's a benefit of dry scooping over anything else. I don't know the ramifications of that.
Yeah. Other than making it, an Instagram video where you're showing yourself doing it.
Yeah.
That's the only benefit, I guess. But no, and let me ask you this. So with someone that's had bariatric surgery and they've lost a significant amount of weight pretty rapidly, and sometimes that is including some muscle mass because their intake is so low. Do you feel that creatine monohydrate would be a good supplement to consider for someone that they've had their surgery, they're starting to increase their overall intake protein, and now they're wanting to strength train and change their body composition?
Yeah, so it's a very unique question because we've never looked at individuals on a hypocaloric diet and then take creatine, and could that overcome some of the detriments? Now, if you look at the principles of creatine, It has some phenomenal benefits to creating an anabolic environment for muscle growth. It is important to know creatine has never been shown to directly increase protein synthesis like protein can, but it does a whole bunch of other things. But what it also does do is create an anti-catabolic environment. It decreases protein breakdown and inflammation. So individuals going under surgery or trauma, they always have heightened inflammation. Individuals with HIV or cancer or cachexia, a lot of inflammation. Those are the populations that could really benefit from a recovery or a clinical aspect. So in this circumstance, anybody going through surgery, definitely consult with your family physician to make sure this is viable. But I see no adverse or reason why those individuals should not only take it, but at least help benefit from engaging in exercise, because it does create an anabolic environment not only for muscle growth, but it decreases inflammation and muscle breakdown. So basically what that means is it helps the individual recover. So maybe they say they can exercise now 3 times a week or 4 times a week, which is beneficial. So again, I think it's a very viable strategy. It's no different than people who have cancer or suffer from frailty or cachexia. We're trying to maintain muscle mass. So protein is critically important. Omega-3 fatty acids are getting a lot of press, but creatine monohydrate should be considered as well.
Yeah. And let's talk about that, since you mentioned, reduction or inflammation, reduction. So let's say, someone wants to take creatine that maybe is an endurance athlete or they're recovering from an injury. Has there been some research? I know not as much on endurance, but has there been any good research looking at the benefits of taking it for, because I do have a lot of endurance bariatric athletes. Would that be helpful for them or recovering from an injury?
It's the hidden type of research that really we weren't talking about, and it's actually quite emerging. We have a paper coming out very soon that's looking at summarizing all the articles. And the best overall way to put it is that, yes, creatine was theorized to be for the weight room and getting bigger, stronger, faster. But now we know some of the other mechanisms. And since it increases the energy status of the cell, it can also help increase a storing capacity of carbohydrate called glycogen, which we use at high intensities. And if it decreases inflammation and increases recovery, it's starting to have promise for soccer or intermittent sports. And it's been shown to have really good anti-inflammatory effects for long duration exercise, such as triathlon or marathon running. So we're now starting to see it's not just for the weight room. Anybody can take it at a recommended dosage, and it can have some viable options for that as well.
Yeah. And then I know that there's been some studies that looked at single limb, like if you have an injury, but you still continue that supplementation. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's important too, because people get injured,
Yeah, absolutely. So the theory of cross education is that if you have an injured limb and you can actually train the other side of the body, you can still get some strength benefits. You may not get hypertrophy, but some strength benefits. So if the person breaks their right leg, they should go up to the leg extension and do unilateral training on the left leg, and you can actually get some switching over there. So that could help with a rehabilitation perspective. And that's a really good study to look at. So we've done a few studies on creatine, and in the immobilized limb, creatine has decreased the rate of muscle loss and or strength loss. So if you break your right leg and you are taking creatine or thinking of it, please train the other side of the body, and creatine can help offset some of the muscle and strength loss. We don't know if it's strong enough to decrease the rate of bone loss, but that's something we would have to look at from a casting perspective.
Sure. Yeah. And talk about, is creatine still beneficial for someone that isn't lifting? I mean, I know I'm going to dive into the other areas now too of creatine research, but so if someone's not lifting or exercise, should they be taking creatine?
Yeah, there's been some clinical studies that have looked at anti-inflammatory effects for knee osteoarthritis and some other factors like that, type 2 diabetes. And there's some emerging evidence to that. The biggest area is on the neck up. So, for example, anybody that has stressful environments, sleep deprivation, concussion, mild traumatic brain injury, neurological diseases, multiple sclerosis, we're starting to see the huge emergence of creatine having beneficial effects, even independent of exercise in combination on the neck up. So anytime the brain is stressed, altitude, pollution, sleep deprivation comes to mind almost on a daily basis. Anybody who has clinical depression or anxiety or PTSD, there's some evidence to suggest that all those conditions decrease the amount of creatine in the brain. And therefore, if you supplement the body with creatine, some of that will go to the brain eventually and accumulate. And that's probably why we're starting to see some beneficial effects from this once was a muscle building supplement to now a brain health supplement. And I'm going to Denver in June at the American College of Sports Medicine, and then Paris in July to speak about the benefits of creatine on the neck up. It seems to be really important from a cognitive memory perspective. We need big trials on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but it does seem to have some beneficial effects for some neurological conditions. It does increase brain creatine content, but the big one is concussion. There's only been 2 studies, and they have been in children. And when these children suffered a concussion within 4 to 6 hours after supplementing with creatine for 6 months, these children on creatine had substantial improvements from various functions compared to the children with concussion on placebo. So creatine seems to improve some aspects of recovery or health in the brain when it's under stress. But I think if the person's brain is not stressed, it might not have any beneficial effects. There's a big difference between the brain and muscle. The muscle doesn't make creatine and likes to take it up. The brain is very picky. It has a blood-brain barrier, and it says, you know what, we make creatine. We don't really want anything coming in unless we decide. So that's why higher, longer dosages of creatine supplementation seem to be viable to increase brain creatine content. And that's why I take 10 grams a day. I take 10 grams a day. That seems to be a general overall dosage from a whole body perspective. And that dose also has been shown to have some bone beneficial effects.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you is so what is that dose that's kind of required to cross that blood-brain barrier? I assume it's higher.
It seems to be higher. There's been some really acute studies where even 5 grams can get into the brain, but it hasn't really led to any of the sort of transformational effects. And again, way more studies need to be done. But the lowest dose ever been shown to improve bone health is about 8 grams with exercise. Okay. The lowest dose for muscle is about 3 to 5. And on average, when you look at the dosages for the brain, it's about 10. You can take more. And since there's no adverse effects by taking slightly more, I personally, based on all the research, take 10 grams a day. Yeah. And we just finished a study where we gave almost 10 grams a day to postmenopausal women for 2 straight years. And it had some beneficial effects and no detrimental effects.
That's what I was just going to ask you. So another population that I do work with, obviously women as well, that have had bariatric surgery and they're, postmenopausal. Can creatine be beneficial for them, especially if they are, certainly lifting as well? But what has been shown for females with creatine supplementation?
Yeah, the biggest benefit is that it decreases the rate of bone mineral loss, and we've shown it in the hip. So just think about the ramifications. If you're younger and you fall on the icy road, you can usually bounce back up. But an older individual, if they have weaker bones, falls, now they may need hip replacement surgery, and that causes them to be inactive and leads to a lot of chronic diseases. And we've also shown some beneficial effects in the lower limb around the ankle area, which again is hopefully preventing falls and fracture. So we start to see a decrease in bone mineral loss and add that to an increase in bone strength. So if you were to take a pencil and try to bend it, the people without creatine could probably break it quicker, whereas creatine just causes it to bend more and withstand more force. So postmenopausal females are our target population because the cessation of estrogen is losing the anabolic nature of estrogen. Again, this is independent of hormone or estrogen replacement. But just by adding weightlifting and creatine, could that little lifestyle intervention have some bone beneficial effects? And the research is mixed, but we do see some benefits over time.
Mm-hmm. And is there any difference in gender? So on the uptake of creatine in females, or like when, through menstruation, is there any change during their cycle that would impact uptake of creatine?
Yeah, the menstrual cycle is a very hot topic now, looking at the follicular versus luteal. And at the end of the day, it seems to be the accumulating evidence says it doesn't matter during the menstrual phase as long as you continue to exercise when you test. But if you can control the phase, great. The more control over things you have, the better. But we do see that overall, there's no difference between males and females in response to creatine. The only thing we're aware of is that for some reason, females don't have the decrease in protein breakdown the same degree as men. And that might have to do with if females in general, and I use the word general really loosely here, if they have technically smaller muscles than male, the average male, they might have a higher concentration already in the muscle, and therefore they may not respond as well. But you could also argue if a female is vegan, they might respond again. So it is a lot of variability with that. But we're not sure if estrogen or other sex hormones are causing an effect. We don't think so. And then again, we see phenomenal benefits for females, especially from increasing muscle or lean mass,
Right.
decreasing or maintaining fat mass, bone mineral. So again, at the end of it, no one's males or females should have or expect any diverse effects. If anything, I see benefits to everybody.
Yeah. And then I just finish up with the bone. So can you talk a little bit about, supplementation of creatine monohydrate and its impact on bone density or,
Yeah.
decreasing the loss of bone as we age?
So in a healthy individual without having osteoporosis or disease state, creatine monohydrate without exercise has no bone benefits. So I want to repeat that. Without exercise, creatine is not going to have the bone benefits. You need to have the resistance training and or walking, whichever it is, as an adjunct. And the dose seems to be about 8 grams or more. That can have the bone beneficial effects. Now, the study we need to do is comparing an 8 gram or higher to a lower dose and see if there is a difference with resistance training. So that hasn't been done. But all I wanted to say is that the lowest dose shown to be effective is about 8 grams in general, with or without a loading phase. So, but the resistance training needs to be there to have some of the effects.
Gotcha. Okay. So what's next? What are some emerging areas or areas that you're excited about that you're going to be looking at?
Yeah, we have a huge grant under review now looking at, and I sort of got this idea from the pandemic when everybody says, whoa, we know exercise is good for you, but stay at home. We're locking the gyms. And then I said, well, a lot of people can't afford a tonal or a Peloton. And so we have some research grants for sarcopenic adults with rubber tubing. We think rubber tubing is a very viable strategy. It's safe. It's very effective. Can creatine and at-home exercise some have beneficial effects for older individuals. And this is very important for people in long-term care facilities, retirement homes, or God forbid, another pandemic, you can still maintain some health. We're going to be looking at the timing of creatine to see once and for all, does creatine on off days, your rest days, have any detrimental effect or beneficial effect there. So we have about 8 studies planned and there's about 12 ongoing. But the big area is depression and anxiety in the brain. We're going to start to look at more direct cognitive measures, memory, questionnaires about depression and anxiety. But we're really starting to look at some reaction time, how the brain processes things a little bit quicker. So there's lots coming. I know creatine's been around for a while, but we're still trying to solve the puzzle, if you will. And every day I wake up, the puzzle just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and a lot more pieces to put in. So
Right. Yeah, and I know obviously if you did any studies on like the population for bariatric patients that have lost significant amount of weight, they're in this hypocaloric state for obviously an extended period of time, really for life. So I would love. I don't know if that'll ever be on the out there, but it's be an awesome
the
area
one I'm
too.
collaborating within United States, we're looking at rehabilitation for males who have prostate cancer. And so we're just really trying to help everybody improve whatever aspect. But again, that's a great, as you mentioned, another population to look at for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, gosh, thank you so much for your time today. I think did we hit every area? Did I miss anything? Is there anything else you want to comment on about creatine that folks should know?
I think we hit on as much as
we did.
Yeah, possible. I'm sure we can come back and do another one again too.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I know. I was, trying to collect as many questions as I could just to make sure we covered all the areas because I think it's just such an emerging area. And, like you said, there's people out there putting out such misinformation or, people talk like I still to this day, I'll talk to colleagues and they're like, oh no, I would never have anyone take creatine. And I'm like, what? And as you're saying, there's so many positive benefits. And as you mentioned, there's like really not a person on the planet that wouldn't benefit in some way from creatine supplementation. So I just wanted to make sure we set the record straight and got the correct information out there from an expert.
Happy to help as much as I can for sure. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Okay. Well, where can the audience contact you or learn more about you and your research?
Probably the easiest is Instagram. At Dr. Darren Candow would be the easiest. I usually try to promote when new articles come out, things like that, or the same handle on Twitter. Those are the 2 easiest. And if there's a specific question, they can just direct message me and more than happy to get back. But I try to put out as much research on that and just things to help the body about exercise snacks and just exercise in general. So, but Instagram seems to be the most popular nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on today and covering everything creatine. We so appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, you can watch the full video of this podcast episode on my YouTube channel, the Active Bariatric Nutrition channel. So make sure to subscribe to it, give it a like. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please share this episode and any other episodes, because again, we're trying to share, science-backed information to the bariatric population, active athletes, to really get the most, benefit from their surgery and then optimizing body composition thereafter. So information like this can be so helpful. So if you don't mind sharing this episode with someone that you think would be find it beneficial, please do. I'd appreciate that so much. You can also follow me on social media on my Instagram, which is at Active Bariatric, as well as my Facebook and TikTok pages. And if you'd like to learn more about my one-to-one bariatric nutrition coaching services, please go to my website, activebariatricnutrition.com, and schedule a free discovery call so we can learn more about each other. Again, thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you, Dr. Candow. We appreciate your time, and we'll do this again next week.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.